Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus, and we are studying this chronologically. And to right now, today, we are in Luke 7, verses 11 through 17, and this deals with Jesus raising a widow's son from the dead. And so we start in verse 11. It said that Jesus had went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village. And the young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd was from the village was with her. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. He said, then he walked over to the coffin, touched it, and the bear stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout the Judea and the surrounding countryside. I bet guy comes around and raises a dead kid from the dead. But and so what we see here in Luke 7 verses 11 through 17 is the first thing we see is Jesus sees the funeral procession. And so funeral processions in this day, what they would do is, if possible, they would bury the deceased the day of the death. And we see this in Deuteronomy 21:23. They tried to bury them as quickly as possible. They didn't have all the modern technology and modern ways of embalming bodies like we do today. So, well, I'm going to take that back. They did have some, let me tell you, but they still tried to bury them the same day. The body would have been, it was dressed in these special burial clothes and sprinkled with various perfumes. It was a whole ritual. They do the same thing with Jesus's body whenever he passes, or whenever he's crucified on the cross. And so one of the customs around this was to have intense weeping surrounding funerals during biblical times. And you still see this in the Middle East some today, as though you'll see them, carry the coffin through the streets, and a very emotional, intense, procession that goes through the streets and stuff like that. And so it was very similar to that. And during that time also, they would have what's called paid mourners who would emerge, and they would wail in a ritual type cue, right? And so to help with this process. And so much of the funeral service centered on these professional mourners, these people who would come out and help with mourning. They would sing psalms, and do elaborate eulogies for the dead. And so this is more than likely what Jesus was seeing when this was happening. And so Jesus comes upon this scene, and it says in verse 13 that his heart was overflowed with compassion. And so the Greek there, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this word. It's if you're following with us in our daily reading, it's in our worksheet. It's a really long Greek word. It looks like something to do with spaghetti. I'm just kidding. But anyways, it's a very long, hard word to pronounce in the Greek, but it literally means to be moved to one's bowels. Right, so it's moved. Like, if anyone in this, have you ever witnessed something and you felt so bad, or you felt such compassion that it stirred in your bowels? Like, it's just it almost twisted your stomach up. And that's the Greek word that's there. It's a deep, deep, deep compassion. It's not so, "Oh, I felt a little sorry for him." It was a huge, deep compassion. And there's a reason why Jesus would have had this compassion for this widow, is because this was her only son that had just died, right? So her husband had already died. Now her only son has died. And so this puts her in a very serious situation back in this day, right? So with those done, she's lost her means of support. Her son was more than likely supporting her. Her husband, who would have been supporting her, died. So now it was her only son. And so there's a very good possibility she could end up living penniless and alone. They didn't have the safety nets like we do today. Right? There was no Social Security. There was no disability, things like that. So you had to survive. And so, the other thing too here is that she more than likely she was past childbearing age, and so no one was really going to marry her, and that was just the reality of that day. Right? If you couldn't produce a son or offspring for someone, then more than likely they weren't going to marry you. And so she would have been easy for prey for swindlers, for people like that, and more than likely she would have been reduced to begging for food. And so she was, that she understood and Jesus understood the situation. I mean, not only had she lost her only son, I mean, which was hard enough, but then it also puts her in this horrible, horrible situation that she's going to be put in. And so he does what he does, right? He goes in and he raises her son from the dead, which would have, I mean, I couldn't imagine what the scene looked like when that happened. People would have been terrified because, I mean, it's not something you see every day. If it happened today, people would probably be terrified, amazed, terrified, all kinds of stuff. And so that's what happens here. So Jesus feels this compassion for her, and he goes and he raises her son from the dead. And I like the verse. It says, "Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother." I love that verse, the thought, the scene around that in verse 15. And I also think that it's interesting that Luke here comments on how he sat up and began to talk, right? And I don't know. I think I'd be in shock. I don't know what I would do. But I don't know. I just like that scene, that idea of Jesus giving this boy back to his mother, and just I can't imagine the great amount of joy that she would have had in that moment, in that situation. The emotional change going from such a grief to great joy would have been something else. And so the people then, obviously, great fear swept over them, and they talk about a mighty prophet has risen among us. And the people thought of Jesus as a prophet, right? Because, like in the Old Testament prophets, he boldly proclaimed God's message, similar to the Old Testament, and sometimes they raised the dead, right? We have Elijah and Elisha, who both raised children from the dead. And so that's why there's their thinking there of, hey, these guys are prophets. That's why they thought they were prophets, or he was a prophet, because they had heard the stories and read the stories of the prophets who had done that before. And so, but they were correct in thinking that Jesus was a prophet, but he was also a lot more, and they didn't quite understand that yet, and that they actually had God himself there among them. And so that's, all the power and all the authority that he had to do those things was because he was God, not just because he was a prophet. And so they didn't see all that. But anyways, I love this story because it just shows the compassion that Jesus had for this widow. And again, it's one of those things that, as we study through this and we look at the life of Jesus and the things that he did, we are to mimic this, right? If we see someone in a situation like this, we should have deep compassion for them. Now, I understand we can't go raise their children from the dead, right? But there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do as Christians and in the name of Christ to help them out. And one of the things I'll say about this, and some of the things that we need to be careful for, is sometimes we'll go to people in situations like this, especially with children, and this is where we've got to be very careful. And you notice Jesus didn't go up to him and be like, well, it's part of God's plan, right? Or it's, he's in a better place, and stuff like that. Those are things we don't need to say to someone who's in the middle of grieving, right? I understand the idea and the thought behind it is for comfort, but it's not. It's not comforting. And so what we need to do is just be there and let them know, I am here for you, right? I don't understand. Like, what can I do for you? How can I pray for you? Things like that. Just be there for them, listen to them, but don't try to make them feel better in this, because they're not, right? Nothing you say is going to make them feel better in situations like this. And so we need to make sure that we show and have that same compassion and stuff like that, and not do things that, in the moment they seem like they're nice, kind things to do, but in the end they actually make things worse. And so we need to mimic Jesus's thoughts and his pattern here of showing this type of compassion to people whenever he sees them hurting. And when we see people out there hurting, we need to show compassion to them, whether they're Christians or not, and show them a kindness. It needs to move to our gut, right? It needs to make us almost sick, right? When we see someone who's struggling or having a hard time or have lost someone, and we need to be there for them. So again, that's the message for today with this, is in just seeing the power of Jesus and the compassion that he has for everyone, no matter who they are. And so I really appreciate this story, and I'm glad it's in Luke. As always, I really appreciate everyone who sticks around and watches these. I really do appreciate it. If you find them helpful, if you find it's something that someone else can learn from them, please share. And as always, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. We're going to continue to put out daily videos, and we're also going to do other studies and look deeper into some other things. And as always, I appreciate you watching.